I'm Tim Owens, the longtime producer of jazz at National Public Radio and creator of NPR's Peabody Award-winning Jazz Profiles, a radio documentary series on the people, places, and things in jazz. The Jazz Profiles shows, nearly 200 of them, are part of the Tim Owens Jazz and Broadcast Collection at the University of North Texas Music Library. And in a partnership with the 32 Bar Blues Foundation, we've picked a handful of noteworthy shows to share with you. With my gratitude to the many producers who helped make the series possible, and my special thanks to the series host Nancy Wilson, we hope you enjoy this presentation of Jazz Profiles.
When you hear 2 or 3 notes of Keith Jarrett, what you hear is the articulation, the liveliness of it, and the whimsy. I mean, he's just enormously open to where something's going to take him, and you really feel like he's just going to go.
This total commitment lets him, go beyond some boundaries sometimes, and he abandons basic structures and conventional ways of playing and just reaches out into whatever it might be.
What I remember most about playing with Keith was this great uplift that we all shared in the music, and he gave his whole self to the music. He came to serve the music.
Pianist Keith Jarrett is a romantic soul with an intellectual's heart, a burning improviser with a composer's sense of clarity. In the last 40 years, Keith Jarrett has played with Charles Lloyd, Art Blakey, and Miles Davis, and he launched an incandescent solo career that made him a defining force in jazz. He turned solo piano performances into an art form itself, while his ensembles epitomized collective improvisation. I'm Nancy Wilson. On this edition of Jazz Profiles, a portrait of pianist and composer Keith Jarrett.
Improvisation's often thought of as fooling around.
Keith Jarrett.
But real improvising is getting to the center of things quicker than any other thing you can do, which is the reverse of fooling around. It's so serious that you don't have any time to make anything wrong because it's gone.
Keith Jarrett has dedicated his life to improvisation. Playing solo, the pianist walks on stage with no music, no plan, and begins from nothingness. His work in ensembles is almost psychic, building elaborate melodic structures out of collective intuition and time-worn standards. Music critic Tom Moon.
He has got the gift of being able to follow an impulse, and he trusts his impulses, and he, on any given one of those standards pieces, he could find 10 directions that each of them would be equally rewarding.
Keith is arguably the leading pianist of our day. He's won countless awards, tops music polls, and his Cone Concerts is one of the best-selling jazz albums of all time. Yet Jarrett doesn't hear piano when he plays. Dennis Russell Davies conducted Keith's performances of the Mozart piano concertos.
I remember one time at a session, he said, I'm doing this because I actually always wanted to sing.
I didn't really ever like piano. In fact, Miles is the only jazz musician I've ever met who knew that before I did. He used to come to hear the early trio with Charlie and Paul. And I walked past his table and he leaned over and said, "You shouldn't be playing piano." I said, "I know. I think I know what you mean." Because it was always like this task of transforming the instrument into, most of the time, a voice, some kind of voice.
Jarrett is a study in contrast and convergence. He's as confident working out the counterpoint of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart as he is negotiating the harmonies of Miles Dewey Davis. In Keith Jarrett, these worlds connect. Except for his music, which flows like a river, everything about Keith Jarrett is as taut as a piano string. He has the short, wiry frame of a featherweight boxer with a thin mustache and hair that was once a full afro frizz, but is now close-cropped for action. His fierce intelligence is countered by an easy and often self-deprecating laugh. Born on May 8, 1945, in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Keith Jarrett began playing the piano before he was 3.
I was determined that I had perfect pitch when I was 3, and that's why I started lessons. But there was a piano in the house, an old upright player piano that had been converted, and I already knew that I had some relationship with this beast when I was 3, even before I started the lessons.
A textbook study of a child prodigy, Keith entered 3rd grade instead of 1st when he was 6 years old. His piano playing was the same way. he was already chafing at the restrictions of his lessons and began improvising on Mozart.
It was a realization of how many other notes could be used other than the ones in the written music I was being taught. And when I would go home, practice Mozart, I might add a note I thought was more appropriate somewhere, and then when I would actually play it at my teacher's, I would play the right note.
Keith appeared on big band leader Paul Whiteman's TV Teen Club when he was 5 and gave a solo recital when he was 7. His repertoire that night included Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and 2 of his own compositions. Called A Walk in the Zoo and Mountain Scene, their titles revealed Keith's impressionistic side at an early age.
They were pictorial, like the Jungle piece. And I would just invent them as they went along, and sometimes they'd have melodies that would always stay the same. And then I'd go off from those into some new area.
Revealing, perhaps, a glimpse of the composer as a young boy, Keith Jarrett, from his 1973 album called Solo Concerts. Allentown, Pennsylvania was not a jazz mecca, yet Keith Jarrett found jazz there, where he got to study with musicians from the big band. In Allentown, he had a trio at the Deer Head Inn. There, he was discovered by Fred Waring, a musician known for his choral albums with Fred Waring's Pennsylvanians.
And they all were swallowed by a big black snake.
Keith toured with Waring and saw the Bill Evans Trio while on the road. Gary Peacock was the bassist with Evans at the time.
I remember the first time actually that we met was outside the Village Vanguard one night after an evening with Bill Evans and Paul Motion. I noticed this one guy looked like he should be home in bed because he couldn't be over 13, and he was introduced as Keith Jarrett, and there was so much energy. I remember my first impression was, get away from this guy, there's too much energy. It's like, hey.
2 decades later, bassist Gary Peacock and Keith Jarrett would be musical companions. At age 18, Keith Jarrett was already an experienced musician. He attended the Berklee School of Music in Boston, and in 1964, he moved to New York City, where he was discovered by drummer Art Blakey. Jarrett joined a Jazz Messengers unit that included Chuck Mangione on trumpet. Drummer Jack DeJohnette heard Keith playing with Art Blakey. He says the pianist was already his own musician.
Keith would always do something different. I mean, overlapping bars and just amazing phrasing for someone at his age. It just poured out of him, like with an intensity, you know.
Keith Jarrett with Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers on the 1966 album Buttercorn Lady. You're listening to a portrait of Keith Jarrett on NPR's Jazz Profiles.
From blues to bluegrass, jazz to country, R&B to rock and roll, we're moved by the proud sound of American music. Welcome to 32 Bar Blues, a fresh groove in the men's clothing world, a place where true originality, craft, and style are valued like the art forms we celebrate. Never curated or private labeled, we design and make the majority of our styles in-house. Cool clothes with enough funk or personality to make you smile, but easy to wear for most any venue. And like our name implies, 32 Bar Blues was born with a heart for the arts. Since our first collection in 2012, we featured more than 100 musicians, writers, and photographers on our pages, giving all profits from the sale of their work directly to them. We also promote a handful of nonprofit arts organizations that deserve extra support. To check out the 32 Bar Blues collection and learn more about our commitment to the arts, visit 32barblues.com.
I'm Nancy Wilson. Art Blakey wasn't the only musician to take note of Keith Jarrett. Saxophonist Charles Lloyd had been playing in Cannonball Adderley's group and was about to launch his own quartet in 1966. For Lloyd, Keith Jarrett was the consummate pianist.
The thing about Keith was that he had this classical technique, but he also had this very soulful brother man thing in him where he could reach and play some serious blues, and we used to get very deep off into some really outrageous blues.
With Jack DeJohnette on drums and Ron McClure on bass, the Charles Lloyd Quartet was an important and popular group in the 1960s. They combined the new jazz spirit of John Coltrane with a more rhythm-based approach that found them performing in rock venues like the Fillmore West. Jack DeJohnette.
We had a mixture of traditional jazz and then, experimentation, mixing R&B, free improvisation, doing just what came up at the moment and just following it.
The Charles Lloyd Quartet, playing Keith Jarrett's Sorcery from the 1966 album Forest Flower. It was with Lloyd's Quartet that Keith recorded his first solo piano work, Love Song No. 3, Charles Lloyd.
Yeah, we were at the Fillmore and the piano wasn't very great, so I told him to play something. And he had the ability to take a broken down piano and to make it into something in those days.
Keith Jarrett going inside the piano on Love No. 3 from Charles Lloyd's Journey Within album in 1967. While he was still with Charles Lloyd, Keith formed his own trio, which included drummer Paul Motian and bassist Charlie Haden.
There was an elasticity in that trio that was basically because we all resisted being comfortable, and yet we liked certain things and didn't like other things as players. But we didn't want to fall into any place where we could just go on automatic pilot.
Jarrett's choice of sidemen revealed his influences. Paul Motian had played with pianist Bill Evans and appealed to Keith's lyrical side. Both saxophonist Dewey Redman, who made the group a quartet, and bassist Charlie Haden were veterans of Ornette Coleman's band. They brought a freer, more angular dimension to the pianist, Charlie Haden.
We started playing compositions, and the improvisation was a spontaneous creation. We would create a new chord structure every time we played the improvisation of the song. Instead of playing on the chord structure of the composition, we created another chord structure that was taken from the inspiration of the soloist and the accompanist.
If the Misfits Wear It, from Keith Jarrett's album Fort Yawa. In 1970, Keith got a call.
Say you're touching something unless you're touching it. And I think music is, in a way, it's a physical touch. Your ears are going through that physical touch. You're not necessarily able to say, this is poison because I'm dying. You don't notice you're dying. So I think there's poisonous music, and I think that we don't notice we're dying.
Coming up, Keith Jarrett finds an angel for his music and launches the solo piano revolution. I'm Nancy Wilson, and you're listening to a portrait of pianist and composer Keith Jarrett on Jazz Profiles from NPR, National Public Radio.
Born from the 32 Bar Blues clothing brand, the nonprofit 32 Bar Blues Foundation was established in 2020 to promote American music, literature, photography, and the artists that create within these genres. Jazz, blues, and roots music are of particular focus, all uniquely American art forms that should be nurtured and advanced for the benefit of future generations. Toward these goals, 32 Bar Blues Foundation seeks out and partners with nonprofit arts organizations that provide education, training, opportunity, support, and exposure. Young and emerging artists, as well as established and lesser-known greats, are of equal focus. Through direct 32 Bar Blues corporate support and donations, customer donations, and all profits received from special clothing items and other partner products in the 32 Bar Blues collection, seasonal contributions go directly to the artists and organizations noted in the Arts section of the 32 Bar Blues website. To date, 32 Bar Blues Foundation has contributed more than $200,000 to its nonprofit partners and provided millions of full-page impressions in the 32 Bar Blues catalog. For more information about 32 Bar Blues and its foundation, visit 32barblues.com and click The Arts or go to 32barbluesfoundation.org.
By the early 1970s, Keith Jarrett, still in his 20s, was coming to renown. He'd played with Art Blakey, Charles Lloyd, and Miles Davis. His own group was critically acclaimed. But during his tenure with Miles, Keith made a connection that would shape the next 30 years of his career. A young record producer named Manfred Eicher was launching a label in Germany called ECM Records. He contacted Keith and offered him the chance to record a solo acoustic piano album.
I was with Miles at the time. I guess I wanted to hear the piano, the acoustic piano. I wanted to see where I actually was, and leave those other electric keyboards. So I was actually on tour in Norway, and we had a day off, and on that day we did Facing You. So I hadn't really played piano for a while.
Keith Jarrett from his 1972 album, Facing You. Each time Keith took the stage for a solo concert, he tried to create from nothingness.
I go in emptier than you can get because I actually have to wipe myself clean of any thoughts of music. If it doesn't start from silence and then just go into some sound, the rest of the piece suffers.
In performance, Keith would reach an ecstatic state. Except for his fingers on the keyboard, he seemed to almost lose control of his body. Music critic Tom Moon.
He will jump up a little bit or actually leave the chair and just sort of be standing almost and sort of hunch himself over the piano. He curves his body so it's like a C over the piano, so his head is sort of the crest of a C. And you feel his concentration. You feel the sense of him really bearing into what he's doing.
Producer Manfred Eicher was entranced by Keith's solo piano performances.
Keith seemed to introduce an entire different musical line to the improvised music. His shape, his incredible sense for form and dynamics and evoking waves and sounds in the music, his crystal touch and all the kind of colors that he got out of the piano made people fascinated when they were seeing and hearing him in the concert, because his touch was at that time something that people did not hear except for maybe classical piano players.
Keith Jarrett from the Cologne Concerts in 1975. Throughout much of the 1970s, Keith Jarrett maintained two quartets. One was named the American Group and featured Charlie Haydn, Paul Motian, and saxophonist Dewey Redman. The other came from Norway and was often called the Belonging Group, named for their first album. That band included saxophonist Jan Garbarek, drummer June Christensen, and bassist Paula Danielson. Keith says he composed differently for each band.
Each one was a relief, sort of like two different mountain ranges, you know, they were different to look at. But the music was coming from the same place, and it just didn't sound the same when it got played by each band. I never played the same music with one band that I wrote for the other band, and that was good. It wouldn't have worked anyway, because the difference was already there.
Saxophonist Jan Garbarek.
I think the American Group was more jazzy, you know, naturally it was. And I think with us it was not as typical jazz themes, you know, they're more melodic. What Jon and Paula did playing with Keith was also a bit simpler, you know, more transparent, I think, than what their American counterparts did at the time.
Critic Tom Moon thought the Belonging Group brought out more of Keith Jarrett's compositional side.
He was thinking in those days much more compositionally, obviously, than in the standard era. And what he was writing was just absolutely gorgeous melody. And to have these guys that were appreciating the lyricism of it and taking the lyricism someplace without it being a 4/4 swing kind of place, you really felt like he, as a composer, he was opening up at that point.
Keith Jarrett and the Belonging Group with Personal Mountains from 1979. You're listening to a portrait of Keith Jarrett on NPR's Jazz Profiles. I'm Nancy Wilson. In the 1970s, Keith began extending his composing into orchestral works. He released the album In the Light for chamber orchestra in 1973. That was followed by Luminescence, written for saxophonist Jan Garbarek. When Keith writes classical compositions, he's not writing jazz piano solos with orchestral backing. That threw the Boston Symphony Orchestra for a loop when they commissioned Keith to compose The Celestial Hawk. Keith Jarrett.
I think they thought they were going to get a jazz marketable album for their symphonies so that they could show that they're keeping up with the times and they're doing some other kinds of things. So they didn't want a serious work. And this was it's serious, if nothing else, it's serious. It isn't a piece for piano, jazz riffs and orchestral accompaniment, and I think that's sort of what they thought.
The Boston Symphony Orchestra ultimately declined to perform the work, but ECM producer Manfred Eicher decided to record it with the Syracuse Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Christopher Keane. A segment from Keith Jarrett's Celestial Hawk, featuring Keith Jarrett on piano. Working with orchestras brought Keith closer to the training of his youth, and he began giving recitals of classical works. He started off with modern composers like Shostakovich and Bartók, but eventually recorded compositions by Handel, Bach, and the complete piano concertos of Mozart.
He really devotes himself to the composer's music.
Conductor Dennis Russell Davies believes you don't hear jazz in Keith's classical performances.
A listener who knows all of the, let's say, recordings of Mozart concertos, when they hear this one, they might say, oh, that's the Keith Jarrett recording. But if they didn't know Keith had recorded it before, they wouldn't say, oh, that's Keith Jarrett playing Mozart, because of some knowledge of him as a jazz musician or whatever. When he plays classical music, he's at the service of the classical composer.
Keith Jarrett with the Stuttgart Chamber Orchestra playing Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 20 in D minor, with Dennis Russell Davies conducting. After a string of classical recitals, Keith returned home in 1985, frustrated.
One day I just got up and came in the studio and picked up a recorder, which I hadn't been playing for a while because I was playing classical piano things. And I realized I had been missing something. It was like if you hadn't prayed for a long time. I came in the studio and used that little recorder to get in that state. And something started happening that was so strong that I thought I would be a fool not to turn on some kind of tape recorder. I wanted it as a document of my state.
Sitting in his studio, Keith Jarrett played recorders, flutes, tablas, shakers, and a touch of piano, overdubbing himself on cassettes. It's an intimate personal diary that became the album Spirits. Keith Jarrett from the album Spirits. In 1983, Keith reunited with bassist Gary Peacock and drummer Jack DeJohnette. They had worked together before on Gary Peacock's 1977 album, Tales of Another, but this was different. Instead of original compositions, they'd be playing standards.
We had a conference before we did our first recording together, and that conference sort of was like having dinner, and they didn't know that I was probing into their reasons for playing music anymore. But what happened was I realized that they all sensed the same thing, that they had been through a lot of music and that they really only wanted to play music. They didn't really want to play their music. So that made it possible to start a good relationship with them.
Well, the first thing that came up was a question mark. Standards? I was like, yikes.
Gary Peacock.
Well, I was kind of like had it with standards. I wasn't too excited about doing anything with standards. So I was kind of taken aback for a minute. I thought, oh, standards, my God.
Gary Peacock was obviously convinced because 17 years later, Keith Jarrett's Standards Trio is still performing. Keith Jarrett playing God Bless the Child with Jack DeJohnette and Gary Peacock from Standards Volume 1. It was clear from the start this was not your conventional approach to the jazz tradition. Critic Tom Moon.
He was sort of saying, well, we can still have fun with this and we can still subvert this. There are ways to attack this music that does not just dust it off lightly, and let's see how far we go. And I think after a few years of that, he showed how far it can go. And of all the neo-traditionalist impulse of the 80s, those still remain the most vital pieces of music.
If I Were a Bell, played by Keith Jarrett, Jack DeJohnette, and Gary Peacock, from Keith Jarrett Live at the Blue Note, the complete recordings. The Standards Trio met with both critical and popular acclaim, yet there was something that vexed many listeners about Keith Jarrett. He sang. He didn't sing lyrics, but in the midst of a rhapsodic solo, you'd hear his nasal whine. Many fans and critics think it's a distraction from Keith's evocative melodies.
When I do trio recordings, I'm making these funny noises, and people keep thinking that this is extraneous or separate from what's going on. Like it can be eliminated. Like, why do they have to have that on there? The answer is there would be nothing otherwise.
Critic Tom Moon.
I think he adds a lot. There are places in many of the recordings where the expression of his voice is as a horn would be, in sort of way in the background, in the back of a very, like an airplane hangar kind of room, just sort of adding an ambient quality to it.
Keith Jarrett, playing piano and singing on Meaning of the Blues from Standards Volume 1. Keith Jarrett is notorious for his limitless energy, unflagging intellectual enthusiasm, and restless creative search. That almost came to a stop in 1996 when he was struck by chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a mysterious and still little understood disease characterized by profound fatigue. Keith was forced to stop touring and could barely even play. He thought it might be the end of his career.
When I got ill, I had a very, very serious realization that I may never leave this house and play again. And if I didn't, I better get my sound together in the studio next to the house, just in case I wake up one morning and I start playing and something magical happens.
Something magical did happen. He went into his studio and began playing love songs as a Christmas gift for his wife, Roseanne. It turned into The Melody at Night with You. Keith Jarrett playing Someone to Watch Over Me from The Melody at Night with You. Commitment and dedication have been the hallmarks of Keith Jarrett. As he works his way back to health, he can reflect on a body of work that is unparalleled in its diversity and depth, but which maintains the unified vision of Keith Jarrett.
I never had another idea of what to do, and it took me for the ride. I didn't take music for a ride. It sort of took me the whole way.
Our tribute to Keith Jarrett was written, produced, and mixed by John Dilberto. Jazz Profiles is produced by Tim Owens, assistant producer Madeline Smith.